Hey, welcome back to our last gasp, which is not a negative thing. It's a lot of fun for me to introduce my friend and my revered colleague, Jenny Sorkin, who is Associate Professor of History of Art and Architecture at University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections among gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. She's the author of Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community from University of Chicago Press in 2016, which examines the confluence of gender, artistic labor, and the history of post-war ceramics. And I'm actually really excited to have Jenny's paper this afternoon because she's going to take us into the wild United States. And we, like, this is secret that I'm sharing with you, but we actually conferred a little bit to make sure we wouldn't be doubling up on Marguerite Friedlander Wildenhain lore. So never fear. This has all been highly choreographed ahead of time to keep you awake. So with that, I'll give you, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you especially to Freya for inviting me, and thank you for all the rest of the speakers allowing me to be the sole Americanist, sole Californian, and the only unabashed, unashamed non-German speaker. So with that, the disclaimer is I'm not going to pronounce Wildenhain or Wildenhain or however all you Germanists say it. I'm just going to say Wildenhain. So. At Pond Farm, the pottery she founded in 1952, Marguerite Wildenhain implemented a Bauhaus-style training camp in Sonoma County, California, long after functional pottery had yielded to ceramic sculpture. Through abstraction and an assertion of scale, the artist Peter Volquez led a younger generation to reconfigure post-war American ceramics during the 1950s. Volquez is renowned for his non-utilitarian ceramic forms built out of heavily worked thrown cylinders and slabs of clay. Often gashed, slashed, or punctured, his objects were controversial both for their destructive qualities and their size, which approximated sculpture in an era, the 1950s, when craft and fine art were still treated as disparate disciplines. But Pond Farm had a distinctly different mission: the dissemination of the Bauhaus's mythic pedagogy to unsuspecting American students who would be inculcated with ceramics as a way of life and go on to imprint its rigor onto future generations. Born Marguerite Friedlander in Lyon, France in 1896 to Jewish parents of English and German origin, Wildenhain holds the distinguished position of being the only woman to achieve the Master Potter designation at the Weimar Bauhaus. When the school closed and the ceramics workshop was terminated in 1925, Wildenhain went on to a successful dual career, simultaneously teaching and designing for industry until, as a Jew, she was forced to flee, first to the Netherlands and then to the United States. And I should say that it was the ceramics workshop that closed, not the Bauhaus itself. Arriving in 1940, Wildenhain became the preeminent Bauhäusler ceramist in the United States, known for her intensive commitment to the vessel tradition and its laborious processes. Consider large jar, a wheel-thrown vessel decorated in shades of ochre and cream. With its tight-fitting lid and handsome textured base, large jar is a perfect showing of technique. At the top of the vessel, lip and lid meet, the seam highlighted by the contrast of color. Two light stripes, one circling the entire base of the lid and the other painted below the edge of the slightly flared rim. The neck descends and then dramatically widens at the shoulder, a deep curvature that is slightly squared, creating a solid base that looms over a nearly hidden foot. Particularly striking, though, is the jar's sharp geometric motif, made by incising neat carved rows of brown triangles that prove cumulative. The first row of the two stacked rectangles give way to a row of 3, and finally a wide final row of 5. This simple addition follows the contours of the form itself, as the vessel's girth seems to expand readily, an illusion created by the enhanced verticality of the longest row of rectangles. Wildenhain was dedicated to the autonomy of the craftsperson, believing that the education of craft was in peril, as it was creating a generation of teachers rather than independent potters who were able and willing to, in her words, live from the work of their own hands. This particular phrase refers to one of several complaints she sent to the American Craft Council, registering her disappointment with the direction of American craft itself. Her utopian sentiments dovetailed with many of the ideals of Black Mountain College. Wildenhain, however, taught at the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland only long enough to secure a work visa and declined to fill Robert Turner's vacant post at Black Mountain before setting out on her own. She visited Black Mountain College twice, once in 1947 to see her close friend, the weaver Trude Germain-Pré, who was teaching with Annie Albers, and several years later for the pottery seminar, held October 15th through 29th, 1952, where she demonstrated, lectured, and debated with her international colleagues Shoji Hamada, Bernard Leach, and Soetsu Yanagi. From 1952 until 1980, Wildenhain presided over a community entirely of her own making, a summer program devoted to the discipline of ceramics, admired for its uncompromising rigor in pursuit of the craftsman ideal. Yet her practice has been misconstrued as object-oriented. Wildenhain's ideology was entirely process-driven. Over 8 or 12 weeks, students threw 500 or 600 pots and left with nothing. By purging her students of the desire to produce finished pots, Wildenhain set her students on a course of non-object production. This is a radical reformulation of pottery, redirecting it away from its traditional object-based orientation in favor of process. Thus, at Pond Farm, ceramics became a live form, valued not as a commodity, but as an experience. In her book, Pottery, Form, and Expression from 1959, Wildenhain coined the term live form, which I have used as both the title and the theoretical underpinning in my own book. Live form describes a wheel-thrown vessel in which the body of the craftsman, through his or her physical manipulation of the clay, determines the size and shape of the most intimate spaces of the vessel itself, its girth and weight, the delicacy of the rim, the strength and placement of a handle, and so on. Seen here, Wildenhain's practiced fingers coax forth a spout, making a physical decision that earmarks the vessel as pourable for use as a creamer or a pitcher. Fascinated by the tactility and careful choreography of her process, the Life magazine photographer Otto Hegel produced a series of photographs on Wildenhain's ceramics process. One of the most compelling images is a montage of her hands in motion, captured as progressive movements frozen in time. This is also the cover of my book. Read as a language of signs, her hands offers a series of visible gestures similar to the signaling techniques utilized by orchestra conductors, underscoring the inherent musicality and performative nature of her art form. In both photographs, the hands are a conduit for the utter absorption of technique in search of perfect form. The precision of an exact tempo at a particular moment, striking notes in unison, the potter opening and lifting the vessel form from a raw mass on the potter's wheel, making instantaneous decisions as she creates width, depth, slope, and height. For Wildenhain, the vessel is live, and that the actions of the artists are permanently registered within the very form of the vessel itself. Her term goes beyond mere maker's mark, conveying the artist's embodiment of form itself through an indexical presence that becomes ever-present and unceasing. Another emigre potter, Otto Knotzler, who came from the Wiener Werkstatt, not the Bauhaus, but also settled in California, although Los Angeles, not Northern California, claimed this same phenomenon immediacy, writing in 1968, "The hand-thrown pot is something that happens at the spur of the moment, and as it happens in a matter of minutes, it reflects the mood of that moment. The pot is formed without tools, entirely by hand, and the soft clay retains the finger marks of its maker. In no other art is there such an immediacy, such personal, close contact." This unique combination of the artist's body producing an immediate form in real time is what makes the work live. This sort of live demonstration became a performative gesture of skill and virtuosity, enacting mastery through the size and difficulty of the forms, endurance, and the performance of the maker. Ceramics is one of the unacknowledged models of the object action in which the live presence of the teaching process was the gesture of the maker. Each summer, around 25 students would come to study pottery with Wildenhain for about 9 weeks at a time on average. She did not accept beginners. Students were routinely sent away or turned away or sent elsewhere to gain basic skills. Pond Farm, unlike Black Mountain College, willfully lacked institutional status. Without any kind of accreditation or degree structure, it had no credibility within the larger American educational system. As Wildenhain herself wrote, "Pond Farm is not a school, it is actually a way of life." However, her history functions as an allegory of illegibility. She was misinterpreted again and again by her American colleagues, who rejected her old world functionalism, even as they profited from her pedagogy. Wildenhain's career is a case study in the gender inequity and media hierarchies that plagued women artists, even those with the best training at mid-century. She represents a series of exclusions: a Bauhaus-trained Jew, a French refugee, German emigre, a woman in the elite reaches of her male-dominated profession, and moreover, a pedagogical demagogue, a proclaimed and self-proclaimed master who still lacked financial security and institutional standing. As an extreme form of living, Pond Farm exceeded any previous limits of labor and discomfort in relation to the production of studio pottery in mid-century America. Yet Pond Farm was also restorative, a way of beginning again on all levels, for urban students unused to roughing it, and for Wildenhain herself in a new country and culture. In its initial years, she provided basic barracks-type lodging on her property, nearly replicating her experience in Weimar. Students were to learn to fend for themselves without a modern kitchen, pooling cookware and food to prepare common meals cooked in a fire pit. For most of Pond Farm's existence, however, students rented rooms in Guerneville, an affluent summer resort town, or camped outside it, which sat on the edge of a redwood forest. Roy Behrens, a former student who went on to teach graphic design at the University of Northern Iowa, recalled his experience of the summer of 1964, writing, quote, "It truly was primitive living. Our only refrigerator was an ice-filled styrofoam cooler, which was constantly coated with moisture. Among the most repugnant sights of the day every morning was to wake up to find the outside of the cooler crawling with dozens of huge green slimy slugs." The rudimentary nature of camp living would not have impressed Wildenhain, as she herself did not own a refrigerator until the early 1960s, one of the many American luxuries of which she disapproved. In her memoir, she disdained it as the holy holy of American life. But this was in keeping with her general distaste for convenience, which led to laziness and shortcutting that she found to be so pronounced in American students. The students who came to Pond Farm, however, were broken of these and other poor habits. The purposeful deprivations experienced at Pond Farm merged with the rigors of slowly, meticulously mastering the medium of pottery. The distance between Guerneville and Pond Farm was a daily 4-mile hike uphill on unpaved roads. Upon arrival, students gathered under the peach tree before 8 a.m. to observe a ritual silence. Afterwards, they were expected to spend 7 to 8 hours per day at the pottery wheel, throwing forms dictated by Wildenhain. While she herself was a studio potter, making singular objects for the art or luxury consumer market, her teaching method, like the Bauhaus, was geared toward industry, or what is known as production pottery, making dozens of wares to be sold as complete handmade sets. Here's that ever-present instruction board. According to 1980s era interviews conducted with former students, Billy Session writes, quote, "Students were thoroughly instructed on wheel techniques and how to develop a critical eye. Beginning students started with the infamous doggy dish, a shape that is somewhat troublesome for beginners. After making 10 or 20 of these, permission was given to move on, and students worked through about 15 basic forms such as flower pots, bowls, bellied coffee pots, spouted pitchers, footed bowls, cups, plates, and eventually teapots. Students brought their lunch and ate together at long wooden picnic tables behind the work barn. Monday through Friday, the workday ended at 4 p.m., and each Wednesday afternoon was devoted to drawing from nature. Wildenhain would frequently hold outdoor seminars and discussions, as you see here, lecturing on various topics, showing her own work or that of other artists, and frequently read literature aloud, often poetry or from the journals of Van Gogh, Rodin, and Delacroix. At the end of the day, students trudged back down the hill into town, unless invited to drink sherry with Wildenhain in her garden. 3 or 4 times a session, evening parties would be held at the beach. Working and living in the natural environment, with an aged Bauhäusler directing the experience, such meditative precision cultivated not only an intensity among her charges, but also perhaps a kind of unspoken honor for the dead, for the fledgling utopia that had been rudely crushed by Nazi culture, a moment of Wildenhain's own youth that could never have been fully explained, but could have indeed been imparted through process. The forms themselves could live on, made and remade by generations of rudimentary potters, eager students grasping and marveling at the complexity and variety of simple forms. The disappearance of the potted object and its subsequent passage into immateriality runs parallel to the greater avant-garde ethos of the 1960s. The anti-object or dematerialized stance of performance, video, and land art, and to a lesser degree minimalism, which rejected the hand-produced or individually wrought object, challenged the hegemony of the materialist tradition in artistic production. Dematerialization also functioned as a critique of the market and its easy commodification of the art object. In doing so, artists were able to propose new relationships between objects and viewers, artists and audiences, and artists and institutions. Ceramics has been left out of this history. However, Pond Farm's anti-object stance troubles the dominant narrative, marking an important and overlooked moment in modern craft. Nathan McMahon, a student who first came to Pond Farm in 1954, described the destruction of the pots at Pond Farm as an act of submission, in which the object and their makers were broken down, only to be rebuilt more robustly. Quote, "More often, the pots were destroyed while the clay was yet plastic, cut through with a wire to gauge the thickness of the walls and to evaluate the quality of our throwing technique. It was a sound practice, offering lessons that otherwise would have been impossible to learn, and they helped separate us from the tendency toward regarding every standing pot as worthy or precious. It helped to speed up the learning process by undermining the persistent ego." End quote. This ritualized destruction contained within it an exchange of power, students giving themselves over to the master, allowing themselves to be trained according to her will. Summer workshop participants came as seekers, looking for an encounter with craftsmanship through subordination. No doubt, such a collective experience of discipline was also a means of undoing the excesses of individuality endemic to the abstract expressionist era: ego, personality, and free expression. Otto Hegel captured the collectivity of the student enterprise at Pond Farm when he captioned this particular image with the following interpretation. The problem for all students was to make a pitcher with a rim. Different personalities, different conceptions, different pots. But in a setting of non-competition, students also had to learn to trust each other's skills and their communal ability to coax the most that they could out of the raw clay. In this way, the non-object pot became symbolic, the subject of a focused reading or deconstruction, and then obliterated, smashed down and made anew, a live form engaged in the endless process of renewal, led by Wildenhain. She herself modeled this resiliency through her own wartime narrative, making the best of what was and starting anew, loyal to the precepts of the Bauhaus and continuing that modernist tradition without a crisis of faith. The intertwining of clay's elasticity and Wildenhain's own resilience functioned as a unique pedagogical model that remains unreplicated by peers of her own generation. Nearly 10 years her junior, her husband Franz Wildenhain apprenticed under Marguerite in Halle Saale, her first job after leaving the Bauhaus. This was a highly unusual arrangement for the era. The couple wed in 1930. Decades later, Franz reflected upon the extreme differences in their education. It is true it took me a long way to find myself, and still I am stumbling further to be overcome myself. M's formative years were altogether under a more happier sky. She was 4 years at the Bauhaus with Marx and Crahan, I only a year. In this way, the short period with Crahan in Dornberg gave me the foundation. In a happier time, Germany, inflation, etc., lost war, political upheaval, ideas new and old hanging like a thick fog over people, I would have perhaps become only a good country potter, making pots people could use, and in between something more. From Franz's observations, we can glean several things. First, happiness is a relative term. Marguerite's time at the Weimar Bauhaus was marked by poverty and hunger, yet, according to Franz, proved artistically rich. This is affirmed by his remark that had he experienced a similar prosperity, he would have ended up just a good country potter rather than an artist. Certainly, the implication is that suffering merits, while affluence produces complacency. Indeed, Franz did prosper. He won multiple prizes at the ceramics national exhibitions and became a well-known ceramic sculptor who left California and taught for the majority of his career at the Rochester Institute of Technology from 1950 until 1970. Franz Wildenhain's sculptural pursuits were quite possibly a way of distinguishing himself professionally from his wife's own functionalism. Yet being embedded in an academic atmosphere most certainly would have led to different and perhaps better opportunities, such as the large-scale ceramic mural commissions he completed here you see at RIT and at other places during the late 1960s. Written in 1974, long after the couple had divorced and become American citizens, Franz's ruminations offered a window to the collective psyche of the Germans at Pond Farm, Black Mountain College, and elsewhere, and the potential for extreme misunderstanding between themselves and their American students. Even after decades of American citizenry, old world values of hardship and uncertainty were not supplanted by a new world order. Rather, their extremity of experience bred a delicate combination of sensitivity and intolerance, which translated into a level of rigor previously unknown in American art schools and humanities-based colleges. As such, the Germans, more politely known as the exile generation, were collectively revered as educators throughout the nation, seen here. and this is just a quick listing. On May 10th, 1940, a mere 2 months after Marguerite Wildenhain's arrival in the United States, Germany invaded Holland, cutting off news from her husband. Franz continued to live in Putten, Holland, and make pottery until 1941, after which he moved to Amsterdam and taught briefly at the School for Applied Arts. He managed to keep a low profile until January of 1943, when he was conscripted into the Nazi army. All of his post-war English language biographical materials gloss over this, politely referring to his time in the German army. This euphemism carries the historical burden of what can only be described as Franz Wildenhain's shame, an unwilling perpetrator whose own wife was a potential victim. For both parties, their situation must have been horrifying and bitterly ironic. Franz had suffered alongside Marguerite, enduring the financial and emotional strains of persecution and fear leading to her eventual flight from Europe. Perhaps Franz had even felt abandoned and residually angry, though had Marguerite remained in Holland and been found, he would have been executed as a Jewish sympathizer. Indeed, the Wildenhains bore witness to exact such an ordeal. Truda's husband, Paul Germampre, who had been a photography student at the Bauhaus, became an active member of the Dutch resistance. He was arrested and executed not long after the German invasion. Franz's Nazi past continued to haunt the couple into the post-war period. The U.S. State Department would not allow him to enter the country. However, it was recommended that he overcome his inadmissibility. Publicly, though, Franz was neither exonerated nor celebrated for the personal risks he took for his Jewish friends and relations. Perhaps he did not crave recognition, but to have been forced to serve an enemy army was still a defeating experience. First in Holland and then again in America, Marguerite had forged ahead, a pioneer in a strange new land, seeking out opportunity and location, and then resettling her younger husband, Franz, who once again had little say in determining his own fate. Due to the nature of their crisis, there was precious little room for macho posturing. Instead, it was Marguerite who operated in a state of gender fluidity, assuming the typical responsibilities of male protector, provider, and the decidedly female role of the domineering mother. An extreme version of this dependency was transposed to America. Franz arrived in New York on September 22, 1947, with nothing more than the simplest of goods: a mattress, a stool, a teapot, family photographs, and some personal effects. Penniless and unable to speak English, he arrived wholly reliant upon Marguerite, who met him in New York, and the couple drove cross-country back to Pond Farm, the art colony that had been established in his absence. They had not seen each other in 7 years. Things did not go as planned. Just 3 years after their reunion, Franz left Marguerite for a local woman and resettled permanently in upstate New York for the remainder of his career. In her work regarding the teaching of Holocaust survivor narratives, literary theorist Shoshana Fellman asks the question, quote, "Is there a relation between trauma and pedagogy?" This takes us full circle, where modern American craft begins as a social service, a therapeutic endeavor for returning veterans, and is transformed into a boot camp, breaking the student potter and remaking him or her through intense training and discipline. What Wildenhain offered her students was a format for living, or what Agamben calls a form of life, writing, quote, "If we give the name form of life to this being that is only its bare existence, and to this life being its own form remains inseparable from it." If we take Wildenhain at her word, where form is taught as a life skill rather than as a lesson, as a survival mechanism rather than as a novel experience, then Pond Farm, as a site of unproductive labor, was indeed a site of exceptionalism, making and remaking exile as a form of life. Fellman notes, quote, "If teaching does not hit upon some sort of crisis, if it does not encounter either the vulnerability or the explosiveness of an explicit or implicit critical and unpredictable dimension it perhaps has not truly taught, end quote. For Marguerite Wildenhain, this crisis was the crisis of freedom. To be without discipline was to be without a form of life, and therefore without a framework on which to structure artistic practice. But her militant and transformative pedagogy was more than just a cathartic response to the trauma of exile or a solution to the inadequacies of the American situation. Even among her most devoted students, Wildenhain had a German problem. That is, her Bauhaus training and her uncompromising fierceness became one singular heritage. Unquestionably, to be German during the early post-war period was to risk being ridiculed or worse, treated as an enemy within the United States at large. Moreover, Wildenhain's emphasis on her French origins account for a sublimated recognition of her Jewishness. But as Ron Nagel, postmodern potter and former Peter Volquez student noted, quote, she was the enemy, absolutely. She was the carrier of the torch for the community of clay, but there was a very specific kind of look and form and so forth that she thought you had to make to be a legit as a potter, you know? It was just dogmatic. And the real cornball romance with her and the toe, kicking that wheel. And I just thought, you know, man, that says it all. The artisan and her wonderful tool, ready to kick that piece of stoneware into immortality, end quote. Nagel mocks Wildenhain's wonderful tool, her wheel. It becomes a phallus despite its unquestionable roundness. Based on her uncompromising authority, Nagel could only conceive of her in masculine terms, a grudging affirmation of her importance. His implicit critique, though, also reflects the intergenerational clash. A bunch of Los Angeles hipsters who used clay as a vehicle of experimentation and rebellion versus Wildenhain's belief in an art form that was imperious and eternal. Training her students in her own image, Wildenhain herself represented a maverick persona, financially independent, emotionally self-sufficient, unconstrained by either traditional domesticity or institutional responsibilities. It was only through her severity and perseverance that she was able to accrue the cult of personality that Volquez had by his bad boy image alone. And unlike Joseph Albers, lauded for his seriousness of purpose, as a woman, Wildenhain was without access to the same systems of rewards. She was neither a master at the Bauhaus nor the rector of an American college. Rather, she was an independent potter whose successes were modest, whose triumphs were incremental, and whose freedoms were hard-won. In 1963, an unexpected crisis arose for her. The California park system intended to accession 4,000 acres of virgin redwood forest and coastal lands to create a protected wildlife and nature refuge that came to be known as the Armstrong Redwoods State Preserve that you see here. As the California Property Acquisition wrote, included in the Wilderness Park project are certain lands owned by you, which is where this arrow is pointing to the location of Pond Farm. While Wildenhain would be compensated for her 7.83 acres, she would have to leave behind the life and livelihood she had worked so hard to build. Her home, with her beloved gardens and grape arbor, her studio, her kilns, and her showroom. Though Wildenhain had left behind all these things before, many times, what she had not yet left behind was a school of her own making. And it was this that she could not bear. Pond Farm was a place unto itself. What Wildenhain had planted would not grow back elsewhere. Her response is revealing in its rare acknowledgement of vulnerability, tinged with defeat. Quote, to leave what I have built up painfully during 23 years nearly single-handed is to condemn me to end my life at a time when I could still have about 10 years of richly creative work, both teaching and producing. One thing I do not feel I have anymore is the physical strength nor the mental stamina to start all over again somewhere else. I have had to move 6 times in my life, twice due to Nazi persecutions, and I just cannot do it another time anymore. Wildenhain had finally been broken. forced to admit her human frailties. But it was not by any of her enemies, real or imagined. Rather, it was the state of California, the homeland she had enthusiastically adopted, forcing her hand. To American-born college students, the tremendous loss and destruction that Wildenhain had experienced would have been unfathomable, indeed untranslatable without Pond Farm as a conduit. Now that Wildenhain's way of life, and by extension theirs, was under imminent threat, she reached out to her students and colleagues. Throughout the spring and summer months of 1963, nearly 200 letters of support were sent to then Governor Pat Brown advocating on her behalf. Fiercely supportive, their actions must have been exceptionally moving to Wildenhain, reaffirming her own belief in the power of the master-student dichotomy for life. Richard Peterson, assistant professor of ceramics at Scripps College, wrote one of the most lucid and heartfelt letters. Dear Governor Brown, I speak for hundreds of artists, teachers, and potters who feel as I do, that Marguerite Wildenhain of the Pond Farm Pottery School and Cultural Center in Guerneville is an outstanding, valuable, and unique asset to California and the nation. Marguerite Wildenhain as a person is so much a part of Pond Farm and it of her as a result of 23 years of unremitting work there, whose studios, workshops, kiln, homes, and associations, that one cannot conceive of separating her from all that she has created there and destroying one of the most important cultural and artistic centers in the country. In August, the letter finally came. Wildenhain was granted what the state called life tenancy, allowed to live out the remainder of her natural life on the property. After her death, the land would be allowed to return to its natural state, with the Park Service reserving the right to dismantle the buildings. Pond Farm would cease to exist. In 1985, Marguerite Wildenhain passed away. Pond Farm as a site ceased to exist. But having created Pond Farm, Marguerite had engaged in what Hannah Arendt termed world building, in which the structure itself is more permanent than the goods and things produced within the structure. Through Pond Farm, Wildenhain bred a particular species of potter, the belief that one's humanity is realized only through one's artistic labor. Bound by their collective experience of hardship, students arrived as artists, as individuals, and left as anonymous artisans, productive subjects bent to the will of form itself. Pond Farm stands as a testament to the power of craft, not as object, but as a form of life, a template for living as an unrelenting process of making. Thank you.